The fire was dying. Eli Cord sat alone at his supper table, the same table where his wife had once laughed, where his son had once spilled milk and cried about it like the world was ending. Now it was just him, a plate of salted venison, and the kind of silence that doesn't comfort a man. The kind that accuses him. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon like something breathing. The lantern threw long shadows across the walls. Eli didn't look up. He hadn't looked up in months. Looking up meant seeing the empty chairs. He was halfway through his meal when he heard it. A voice, small, barely above a whisper, coming from just outside his door. "May we have your leftovers?" Eli's fork stopped. He'd been out here long enough to know the sounds of the desert at night. Coyotes. Wind. The creak of dry wood. But a voice, a child's voice, at this hour, in this place, 12 miles from the nearest town, with no horse sound, no wagon, nothing? He set down his fork slowly. His hand moved without thinking to the rifle leaning against the wall. He stood. Crossed the room. Put his hand on the door. And for a moment, just one, he hesitated. Because the last time Eli Cord opened a door to a stranger, he lost everything. But something about that voice. Something about the way it trembled. The way it didn't beg, it just asked, quiet and careful, like whoever was out there had already been told no 100 times and was prepared to hear it again. He opened the door. And what he saw on the other side would unravel him completely, not in one single moment, but slowly. Like a thread being pulled from the center of a man's chest until there's nothing left holding him together. What would you have done? To understand what Eli Cord felt when he opened that door, you have to understand what had been done to him. Not just what had happened, but what had been done. Because there's a difference. Things happen in this world by chance, by nature, by the cold indifference of a sky that doesn't care who's under it. But what came for Eli Cord was deliberate. It was chosen. And it was done by men who were still breathing while he sat alone eating supper off a dead man's plate. Eli had come to the Cimarron Valley 8 years before any of this. He'd come with Ruth, his wife, and their boy Thomas, who was 4 at the time and already had the habit of picking up rocks and studying them like they held secrets. Ruth used to say Thomas would be a scholar someday. Eli used to say he'd be a rancher. Thomas, whenever they argued about it, would hold up whatever rock he'd found and show it to both of them, as if to say the rock agreed with him alone. They built the homestead with their own hands. Every plank, every beam. Eli's palms had split open twice during the first month, and Ruth had wrapped them with strips of her petticoat without a word of complaint. The well they dug was 18 feet deep. The cattle they started with were 7 head, thin, nervous animals that Eli had traded 3 months of labor for. Working a cattle drive south through the worst summer anyone in the territory could remember. But the land responded to them. Slowly, the way land does when people earn it honestly. The grass came back in the southern field. The creek held water through 2 consecutive dry seasons. The cattle multiplied. Within 4 years, Eli had 32 head, a functioning operation, and a son who still collected rocks but was also learning to ride. And then came Dolan Marsh. Dolan Marsh arrived in the Cimarron Valley the way a drought arrives, quietly at first, then everywhere at once, then impossible to imagine not having always been there. He came with money, which in that country meant power. He came with men, which meant force. And he came with a patent land claim that his lawyers in Santa Fe had shaped like a knife, specifically designed to cut through the existing homesteads along the valley floor. Eli wasn't the first to fight it. He was just the last one standing. The others, the Perkins family, Old Sutter, the Garza brothers, they'd each taken the offer, which wasn't really an offer. It was a number written on paper and a look from one of Marsh's men that communicated very clearly what happened to people who said no. The Perkins family left on a Tuesday. Old Sutter was gone by Friday. The Garza brothers held out 2 weeks before their barn burned down in the middle of the night with 12 of their horses inside. After that they left too. Eli didn't leave. He sent Ruth and Thomas to her sister's place in Tucson when the threat started. He kissed Ruth on the cheek and held Thomas's face in both hands and told him to study hard. Whatever he decided, rocks or cattle, it didn't matter. Then he watched them ride away in the wagon, and he turned back to his land, and he loaded his rifle. The confrontation with Marsh's men lasted 3 minutes. There were 4 of them. Eli was alone. He woke up 2 days later in the dirt outside his own front door with 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and his cattle gone. The house had been ransacked. The deed to his land, the original document, signed and witnessed and filed in good faith, was missing. He rode to the sheriff in Portales. The sheriff listened politely, offered him coffee, and explained that without the deed, there wasn't much that could be done. That Mr. Marsh was a prominent man. That the valley had seen a lot of change lately, and sometimes change was hard. Eli set the coffee down on the sheriff's desk without drinking it. He walked out into the sunlight. He stood there for a long moment squinting at nothing. And something inside him, something that had been warm and forward-looking and full of plans, went still. Not dead. Just still. He sent word to Ruth that it wasn't safe to come back yet. He got a job as a ranch hand for a spread 30 miles north, worked through the winter with his ribs still healing, and saved every dollar. He didn't touch whiskey. He didn't fight. He didn't talk much. He simply waited. Because Eli Cord believed, with the bone-deep conviction of a man who has nothing left to spend his faith on, that Dolan Marsh was going to make a mistake eventually. And when he did, Eli intended to be close enough to see it. What he didn't account for was what might happen in the space between that night and that moment. What might walk up to his door while he was waiting. What small, terrible, miraculous thing might ask him, in a voice barely louder than the wind, for his leftovers. There were 2 of them. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, with hair the color of creek mud and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She was thin in a way that wasn't natural, the kind of thin that comes from weeks of wrong, not just a skipped meal. Her dress had been patched so many times that the original fabric was almost a memory. Her boots were men's boots, 3 sizes too large, and she'd stuffed the toes with what looked like dried grass to keep them on. Behind her, half hidden in the dark and using the girl almost as a shield, was a boy. Younger, maybe 6. He didn't speak. He just watched Eli with enormous, bruised-looking eyes, his small hand wrapped around the back of the girl's dress like he was holding on to the only solid thing in the world. Eli stood in the doorway and looked at them. He looked past them into the darkness. Nothing. No adults. No horses. No camp lantern in the distance. Just the empty desert and the sound of wind and the stars hanging overhead like they didn't know what to do about any of this either. "Where are your folks?" Eli asked. The girl's chin came up slightly. Not defiant, careful. She had the look of a child who'd learned that showing too much too soon was dangerous. "Gone," she said. Eli waited. "Mama passed 3 weeks back," the girl said. "Papa." She paused. Something moved through her face that had no business being in a child's face. "Papa's been gone longer." Eli looked at the boy again. The boy hadn't moved. Hadn't blinked much, either. "Where'd you come from?" Eli asked. "Followed the creek," she said. "Seen your light." The nearest creek ran about 4 miles east, which meant these 2 children had walked at least 4 miles through the dark in boots that didn't fit, with no lantern and no food. And the older one had thought clearly enough to follow the water instead of wandering blind. Eli looked at the girl for a long moment. There was something about her eyes. He'd thought at the instant she'd spoken, that strange, dark quality to them, the way they held his gaze without flinching even though the rest of her looked like she might fall over. He'd seen eyes like that before once. He tried to remember where and couldn't quite catch it. "What's your name?" he said. "Clara," she said. "Clara Doves." The boy finally made a sound, a small adjustment, a breath that might have been the beginning of a word. Clara reached back without looking and put her hand over his. "That's my brother, Seth," she said. "He don't talk much. He used to. He stopped for a while." Eli stepped back from the door. He didn't say come in. He didn't need to. He just stepped back, and the girl seemed to understand that the space he'd made was an invitation, and she took Seth's hand and they came inside. They stood in the middle of his floor and looked around. Eli watched them take in the room, the half-eaten supper, the dying fire, the empty chairs. Seth's eyes stopped on the two empty chairs and stayed there for a moment, and Eli had to look away. He pulled out both chairs, sat the children down, put the rest of his venison on a plate between them, and cut it smaller without being asked. Clara ate with the controlled urgency of someone who'd learned not to show desperation. Seth watched the food for a moment before he ate, like he was making sure it was real. Eli put water on to heat. He stood at the stove with his back to them and tried to think clearly. He didn't know these children. He had no obligation to them. His situation was precarious enough. He was a man with enemies, a man living on borrowed time, staying close to Dolan Marsh's territory for reasons that were not peaceful. Bringing children into that was foolish, possibly dangerous. But when he turned back around, Seth had fallen asleep sitting upright in the chair, his head drooping forward, one hand still on the fork. And Clara was looking at Eli with those dark eyes, and she said, very quietly, so as not to wake her brother, "We won't be no trouble. I promise." "We never are." And something in Eli Cord, something he thought had gone still forever, started to move again. Because he recognized it now. He knew where he'd seen eyes like hers. He'd seen them in the mirror, after he sent Ruth and Thomas away. After the sheriff offered him coffee. After he stood in the sunlight, and something inside him went quiet. Clara Doves had the eyes of a person who had already survived the worst thing and was simply, quietly, stubbornly refusing to let it be the last thing. He'd forgotten that look could belong to a child. He pulled a blanket from the trunk by the wall, draped it over Seth without waking him. Then he sat down across from Clara and laced his fingers together on the table and said, "Tell me about your mama." And she did. Her mother's name had been May Doves, and she had been, by Clara's account, the best cook in Hardin County and the worst judge of men in the entire territory of New Mexico. Clara didn't say the second part with bitterness. She said it the way a child says something they've heard adults say and absorb as fact, not fully understanding the weight of it yet. May Doves had come to the Cimarron Valley 2 years before with a man named Porter, who had promised her a house and land and turned out to have neither. When Porter left, which happened on a Thursday morning with no warning and no note, May was left with 2 children, a rented room above the feed store in a town called Ridley Flat, and a debt that the landlord was not inclined to forgive. She'd worked. Clara said this plainly, without drama, because to Clara it was just a fact. Her mother had worked the way breathing was work, constant and necessary and never quite enough. She'd cooked and cleaned and taken in mending and sat up late darning other people's clothes by lamplight until her eyes gave her headaches that lasted days. She'd kept them fed. She'd kept them together. Then she'd gotten sick. It had started as a cough. The kind of cough everyone gets in the dry season, the kind that means nothing. But it didn't leave. It deepened. It moved into her chest and took up residence there, and the doctor in Ridley Flat, there was only one, and he was more confident than competent, told her it was dust fever and recommended she rest. May Doves could not afford to rest. By the 3rd week, Clara was doing the mending herself. By the 5th week, she was also cooking for 2 of the families on the main street whose wives had said yes when Clara knocked on their doors and offered. She was 9 years old. Seth had stopped speaking sometime during the 4th week. Clara wasn't sure exactly when, she'd been too busy to track it precisely, which was something she said with a flash of guilt across her face that she quickly smoothed away. May passed on a Sunday. Clara had been there. Seth had been asleep. Clara had sat with her mother for a while, then woken Seth, then packed what she could carry. Then walked out of Ridley Flat because the landlord had already told them the room would need to be cleared. She didn't cry when she told this part. She looked at the table while she talked, tracing the grain of the wood with one finger, and her voice stayed level. Eli sat across from her and said nothing. He'd learned, somewhere in his years, that some stories don't need your reaction. They just need to be heard. "We was heading toward Tucson," Clara said. "I heard there was an orphan house there." "A good one." She glanced up at him briefly. "I heard they don't split siblings." Eli looked at Seth, still asleep in the chair. "How far did you get?" he asked. "Don't know exactly," Clara said. "My counting of miles ain't very good. We rode with a supply wagon for 2 days, then the driver left us at a crossroads. Said he was turning north." She paused. "He gave us some bread before he left. He was kind about it." Eli thought about the geography. Tucson from here was a long way. For 2 children on foot, following creek beds, it was close to impossible. "You were going to walk to Tucson," he said. "We were going to try," Clara said. The distinction was subtle but intentional. She'd been measuring her certainties very carefully, this girl. Only promising what she actually knew she could deliver. Eli stood up and added a log to the fire. The room warmed. He put a pot of beans on. He'd had them soaking since morning, not expecting to want them tonight, but now he was glad they were there. "Your papa," he said carefully, his back still to her. "You said he's been gone longer." Silence. He turned around. Clara was looking at the fire. Her jaw was set. "Yes," she said. "What happened to him?" Another silence. This one different, not empty, but packed full of something she was deciding whether to unpack. "He worked for a man," she said finally. "A landman. A man who buys things. Claims and such." Eli went still. "He wasn't a bad man, our papa," Clara said, and she said it the way people say things they need to be true more than they know them to be true. "But he worked for a bad one. And when he tried to stop, when he told the man he wouldn't do it no more—" She stopped. Her fingers stopped moving on the wood grain. "He didn't come home." "What was the man's name?" Eli asked. His voice was very quiet. Clara looked up at him. "Marsh," she said. "Dolan Marsh." The fire crackled. The wind moved outside. Seth slept. Eli stood completely still for so long that Clara started to look uncertain, like she'd said something wrong, like she should take it back. Then Eli turned away and stirred the beans and said, in the most level voice he could manage, "You'll sleep here tonight. Both of you. We'll figure the rest in the morning." But his hand on the stirring spoon was white-knuckled. And the world had just gotten considerably more complicated. He didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window with his rifle across his knees and watched the darkness thin out into gray, and then into the pale, tentative gold of early morning. And he thought about everything Clara had told him and everything it meant. Dolan Marsh. The same man who had taken his land, broken his ribs, run off his cattle, and bribed a sheriff. The same man Eli had spent the better part of 2 years positioning himself to confront. The man whose operation Eli had been slowly, carefully learning, the routes his men rode, the people he paid, the paperwork he filed in Santa Fe that was almost legitimate but not quite. And now 2 children were asleep in his spare room, children whose father had apparently worked for Marsh, tried to leave, and disappeared. Children who were, whether they knew it or not, potential witnesses to things that could matter enormously if anyone with authority was ever actually willing to listen. Eli understood immediately that this was dangerous. Marsh would not want these children talking. He might not even know they existed, might not know that his former man's family was out here somewhere, alive and moving through the territory. But if he found out, the calculation would be simple and ruthless. The safe thing, the survival thing, was to take them to Ridley Flat at first light, leave them with whatever passed for civic charity in that town, and ride away. His plan was already in motion. He'd spent 2 years building towards something. Adding 2 children to the equation wasn't just complicated. It was potentially suicidal. He knew all of this. He sat with the rifle and the gray light and thought it through completely, honestly, without flinching. Then he heard Seth. Not words, Seth still wasn't using words. Just a sound from the back room, a small, frightened exhalation, the kind that comes when a child wakes in an unfamiliar place and the space between sleep and recognition is pure terror. A half-second of absolute smallness. And then Clara's voice, instantly. "'S all right. I'm here. We're all right." Eli stared at the window. The sky was going gold now. An eagle was working the thermals above the canyon rim, riding the morning air with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. He put the rifle down. He went and made breakfast. When the children came out, Seth pressed close to Clara, blinking in the morning light. His hair wild from sleep, Eli had eggs and the rest of the beans and coffee for himself and warm water with a piece of sugar for Seth. Because he'd found the sugar in the back of a shelf and figured a 6-year-old who hadn't spoken in weeks deserved something sweet. Seth stared at the sugared water for a moment. Then he looked up at Eli. And very quietly, with the gravity of someone making a significant announcement, he said, "Thank you." Clara's head turned so fast it was almost startling. Seth looked at her. He seemed surprised too, surprised at himself, like the words had come out without his full permission. Then he looked back at the cup and picked it up with both hands and drank. Clara looked at Eli. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't let it become tears. She nodded once, a tiny, fierce nod, like she was filing this away. Like this was information that mattered. Eli cleared his throat and sat down. He'd thought all night about what the smart thing was. He'd decided something that wasn't entirely smart. He was going to tell Clara the truth, or enough of it, because she deserved to understand what she'd walked into. "The man your father worked for," Eli said, keeping his voice even while he ate. "Marsh. He wronged me too. Took my land. Ran off my cattle." He paused. "I've been here, close to his territory, because I intend to do something about it. Through proper means," he added, because Clara was 9 and he didn't want her to be afraid of him. "I've been gathering evidence. Things I can take to a federal judge rather than the local law, because the local law is already in his pocket." Clara listened without interrupting. "What I'm saying," Eli continued, "is that this place isn't the safest right now. Being around me might carry some risk. You need to know that." Clara looked at him steadily. "What kind of risk?" "Marsh has men who watch things for him. If any of them see me with children, if they figure out who you are." He let that sentence finish itself. Clara was quiet for a moment. Seth was drinking his water, seemingly content, listening without appearing to listen. "Where else would we go?" Clara said. Eli didn't have a good answer for that. "I could take you to Ridley Flat," he said. "Leave you with the church there." "The church in Ridley Flat gave us a meal once," Clara said. "Then they told us they couldn't take on charity cases permanent." She said it without reproach, just information. "They had their own troubles." Eli nodded slowly. "The thing about your father," he said. "What he knew about Marsh. What he might have told your mother before he disappeared, that information could matter. If you know any of it, or if your mother ever said anything, she said enough," Clara said quietly. Eli looked at her. "She wrote it down," Clara said, "before she got too sick to hold a pen. She said she didn't want it to disappear with her. She reached inside the front of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and soft from handling, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry. She set it on the table between them. She told me to find someone trustworthy and give it to them." Eli looked at the paper without touching it. "How do you know I'm trustworthy?" he asked. Clara considered him with those dark, unblinking eyes. "I don't," she said. "But you fed us without asking what was in it for you. And you told me your danger instead of hiding it. She paused. That's more than most. He picked up the paper. What he read changed everything. May Doves had been a careful woman. Whatever else she was, however poorly she'd chosen in men, however many wrong turns the road of her life had taken, she had possessed, in her final weeks, a crystalline clarity about what mattered. She'd watched her husband get involved in something corrupt and catastrophic. She'd watched him try to extract himself. She'd watched him vanish. And in the slow, terrible weeks that followed, burning up with fever and knowing she was burning, she had written down everything she knew with the methodical precision of someone who understood that she was the last keeper of a story that needed to outlast her. The document was 5 pages. Clara had all 5, folded together, numbered in her mother's hand at the top corner of each. It began with names. Real names. Not just Olin Marsh, but the 2 county commissioners Marsh had bribed to expedite his land filings. Not just the sheriff in Portales, but the circuit judge in Santa Fe who had received, according to May's account of what her husband told her, a regular payment in the form of cattle, unmarked, delivered quarterly to a middleman in Albuquerque. The judge's name was Harlan Fitch. He was, to Eli's knowledge, still on the bench. It continued with specific instances, dates and locations and amounts. A homesteader named Perkins who had been offered $300 to leave, paid not in cash but in a promissory note that Marsh's lawyers had subsequently structured to default, leaving Perkins with nothing. The Garza brothers' barn, May's husband, whose name was Robert Doves, had been ordered to set the fire. He told May about it that night, sick with it, and she'd written down exactly what he said, the date, the time he'd come home. And then the most dangerous piece of all. Robert Doves had discovered, by accident, going through papers he wasn't supposed to see in Marsh's office in Ridley Flat, that the original land patent Marsh was operating under was itself a forgery. Not just aggressive legal maneuvering. An outright, provable forgery. The surveyor who had supposedly certified the boundaries had died 6 months before the certification was dated. Marsh's men had signed a dead man's name. Robert had copied the relevant details. Dates, surveyor name, certification number. May had included the copy. Eli sat at the table for a long time after he finished reading. This was not the evidence he'd been gathering for 2 years. This was better. This was enough to pull the entire structure down, not just inconvenience Marsh, not just tie him up in a local dispute that a bribed judge could dismiss, but bring federal involvement. Land fraud at this scale, with a forged survey and a compromised federal judge, was not a county matter. But having it and using it were 2 different things. Getting this to the right hands, hands that hadn't been paid by Dolan Marsh, meant getting out of the territory. It meant Santa Fe, and not Judge Fitch's courtroom. It meant the Federal Land Commissioner's office, or a U.S. Marshal who operated out of district rather than locally. And it meant doing it quickly, before Marsh's men, who did occasionally pass this way, Eli had seen them twice in the last month, found some reason to pay him a closer visit. He folded the document carefully and wrapped it back in its oilcloth and set it on the table. Clara was watching him. "It's important," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eli said. "Will it help?" Eli thought about how to answer that honestly without terrifying her. "It can," he said. "If it gets to the right person. My mama thought it was important enough to write down even when her hand shook," Clara said. "Even when the pen made her cough." She paused. "She thought it might help other people. People like us." Eli looked at her. People like us. She meant dispossessed people. Cheated people. People who'd had things taken from them by someone with more money and fewer morals. Clara Doves, 9 years old, had inherited her mother's conviction that the story mattered. That the truth, written down carefully, was worth something. He stood up abruptly and went to the window. Marsh's men had a route. They rode the Southern Ridge Road on Tuesdays and Fridays, he tracked it carefully. Today was Monday. That gave him, theoretically, a window. But he'd been alone in his planning until now. Alone, he could move fast and quiet and unpredictably. With 2 children, one who didn't speak and wore oversized boots and couldn't be pushed past a certain pace, fast and quiet became considerably harder. He heard Seth make a sound behind him. A small, contented sound. He turned. Seth had found one of Thomas's old wooden animals, a carved horse that Eli had never been able to make himself put away, and was examining it with the focused attention of a child who gives everything his full consideration. It was Thomas's horse. Made by Eli's own hands on a cold December night when Thomas was 3 and asking for a horse for Christmas, and Eli didn't have the money but had a knife and a piece of cedar, and all night. He should take it back. That's what the rational, self-protective part of him said. Instead, he watched Seth turn the little horse in his fingers, studying the grain of the wood, the rough carved mane, the slightly uneven legs. Then Seth held it up and looked at Eli and said very seriously, "Horse." 2 words in one morning. 2 more than he'd said in weeks, according to Clara. Eli cleared his throat. "That's right," he said. "Horse." Seth nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining it. Eli turned to Clara. "We're leaving tonight," he said. "All 3 of us. I have a contact in a town called Belen, a man who works with the Federal Land Office. If I can get your mother's document to him, he can get it to people who can act on it." He paused. "It'll be a 3-day ride." Clara straightened. "We can ride. I've got 1 horse. Then we'll manage." He believed her immediately. He wasn't sure why, or maybe he was. He'd seen what she was made of. She was made of the same thing her mother had been made of, writing down truth with a shaking hand. She was made of the same thing Eli himself had once been made of, before he got tired. "One more thing," he said. "If we run into anyone, Marsh's men, strangers, anyone, you don't know me. I found you on the road, I'm taking you to the next town. That's all." He looked at Seth. "Can he understand that?" Clara glanced at her brother. "He understands more than people think," she said. "He always has." Seth looked up from the wooden horse, met Eli's eyes, and nodded once. Eli went to pack. He didn't let himself think about what came after, what happened when the document was delivered, when the machinery of federal justice either ground Marsh to dust or proved, as it sometimes did, that even federal justice had a price. He didn't let himself think about what happened to 2 orphaned children with no legal guardian in a territory that didn't have good answers for that problem. He thought about tonight. The road. The 3-day ride to Belen. One thing at a time. Outside, one of his horses nickered softly, and the sun climbed higher, and somewhere on the Southern Ridge Road, it was still Monday. For now. They rode out at dusk. Eli had 2 horses, his main animal, a gray quarter horse named August, and a spare he'd been slowly nursing back from a bad leg. A smaller roan called Pepper that was now sound enough for a light load. He put the children on Pepper, Seth in front of Clara, and took August himself, and they went south-southeast along the canyon floor, away from the ridge road, using the creek bed as their path where the water was low enough. Clara rode well. Seth rode the way he did everything, with quiet, careful attention, not holding the saddle horn but sitting balanced, watching the land go by with his enormous eyes. The first night was uneventful. Eli pushed them until midnight, then made a cold camp in a rock overhang he'd sheltered in before. No fire. Hard bread and jerky and water. Seth ate without complaint. Clara asked 3 intelligent questions about the route, how far to Belen, what was in between, and whether Eli knew the road, and accepted his answers with a crisp nod each time, as if she were confirming logistics. The second day was when things went wrong. They were 3 hours into the morning ride when Eli spotted the dust. southwest, moving along what he recognized as the Ridley Flat Spur Road, a track that crossed their route in about 2 miles. 3 horses, maybe 4. Moving at the kind of pace that meant business, not leisure. He held up his hand and they stopped. "Riders," he said quietly. Clara looked. "Marsh's men?" "Could be." He studied the dust. "Could be anyone." But his gut said otherwise. His gut had been in this territory for 2 years and it knew things his eyes were still catching up on. He thought fast. The canyon to their east offered cover but would slow them. The open ground to the west was faster but completely exposed. The spur road crossing was unavoidable, unless they cut back north, which cost them hours they didn't have. "We go east," he said. "Into the rocks. We move quiet." They went east. It was slower, rougher, the horses picking their way through broken terrain that required patience either animal particularly felt like offering. Pepper stumbled once, caught himself, and Seth made a small involuntary sound but stayed on. Eli glanced back and Clara had one arm braced around Seth and the other managing the reins with competence that a grown man might have been proud of. They made the rocks before the riders hit the spur road crossing. Eli dismounted and put his hand on August's nose, not covering the nostrils, just resting there, a familiar pressure the horse had learned meant quiet, still, now. Clara copied him with Pepper without being told. Seth sat motionless. The riders came to the crossing. 4 men. Eli pressed against the rock and looked through a gap without exposing himself, and his chest went cold. He knew one of them. A broad man on a dun horse, wearing a black hat so weather-beaten it had gone gray at the crown. His name was Cutter Vance. He was Marsh's primary enforcer, the man who had stood over Eli in the dirt outside his own home, 2 years ago, and watched while 2 others kicked in his ribs. Eli had memorized the face. He'd had 2 years and a great deal of quiet anger to do the memorizing. Vance stopped at the crossing. The other 3 stopped with him. One of them said something Eli couldn't hear. Vance looked around, a slow, methodical scan that was practiced and professional. His gaze moved across the rock formation. Eli did not breathe. Beside him, Clara stood absolutely still. She wasn't trembling. She had both hands on Pepper's nose and she was looking at the horse's eyes, not at the riders, with the focused calm of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Seth sat on Pepper's back like a figure carved from the same rock they were hiding in. Vance's skin moved on. After a long moment, long enough that Eli counted seconds to stop himself from doing anything foolish, the 4 riders moved on, heading east along the spur road. Away from them. Eli let the breath out. He looked at Clara. "You did good," he said. She exhaled slowly. "Who was that?" "Marsh's man," Eli said. "The main one." Clara absorbed this. "They're looking for something." "Possibly," he said. "We keep moving." They pushed hard through the afternoon and made Berlin by early evening of the 3rd day, arriving road-dusted and tired at the back door of a dry goods store whose owner, a spare, precise man named Aldous Webb, looked at Eli and then at the 2 children and then at Eli again without comment, opened the door, and said, "Get inside." Aldous Webb was Eli's contact. More than that, he was, officially, a deputy recorder for the Federal Land Office, a position so obscure and administrative that nobody in Marsh's network had ever thought to pay attention to it. Aldous had been quietly building a case against Marsh for a year, working from the other direction, the paperwork angle, and Eli had been feeding him what field intelligence he could gather. Eli laid May's document on Aldous's back table. Aldous read it in silence. All 5 pages. He turned pages carefully, went back twice to reread specific sections, and when he finished he set it down, and removed his glasses and cleaned them. Which Eli recognized as the thing Aldous did when he needed a moment. "This is the surveyor," Aldous said. "Matthew Coe. Deceased October of 1871. The certification is dated March of 1872. Yes," Eli said. This is enough for federal, Aldous said. This combined with what I have. This is enough. He looked up. You know what happens now. It moves to federal jurisdiction, Eli said. Out of Fitch's hands. Fitch gets named in here too, Aldous said. He's done. He paused. Marsh's operation in the valley gets frozen pending investigation. The homesteads, the ones that were taken, could they be restored? Eli asked. Aldous was quiet for a moment. Some of them. The legal mechanism exists. It's not fast. He paused again. But it exists. Eli nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. The children, Aldous said. What happens to them? Eli had been asking himself this question for 3 days. He hadn't landed on a satisfying answer. He looked over his shoulder. Clara and Seth were in Aldous's kitchen, where Aldous's wife, a capable, warm-eyed woman named Frances, had sat them down and was feeding them a proper meal with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't ask a lot of questions and helped first. Seth was eating. Clara was eating and also watching Frances with the tentative expression of a child who wants to trust something but has been burned enough times to do it slowly. Eli watched them. He thought about Ruth and Thomas in Tucson. He'd written to Ruth twice in the last year. She'd written back. The letters were careful and short, and underneath the careful shortness was the shape of something that hadn't ended. Only been suspended, the way a note on a piano string keeps vibrating even after the hammer falls, even after the room goes quiet. He thought about what it would mean to bring Clara and Seth to Tucson. What Ruth would say. Whether Thomas, now 6 years old himself, would show Seth his rocks. He thought about whether he had any right to make that kind of decision about the children, or about Ruth, or about the shape his life was supposed to take. He thought about May Dove's writing truth down with a shaking hand, for people she would never meet, in the hope that it helped. He thought about Clara, 9 years old, carrying her mother's words across a desert in oilcloth. He thought about Seth saying horse and thank you, 2 words returning like the first water in a dry creek, tentative, then real. He stood up. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from the children, and Frances quietly withdrew. Clara looked at him. Seth looked at him. There's something I need to say, Eli said. Clara waited. Her dark eyes steady, patient, measuring. I'm not your family, he said. I know that. I don't want you to think I'm pretending to be something I'm not. He paused. But I'd like, if you're willing, to write a letter to my wife. Tonight, while Aldous files the paperwork. I'd like to tell her about you too. Clara's face was very still. And then, Eli continued, I'd like to ride to Tucson, and let her meet you, and let her decide. And let you decide. He looked at Seth. All of you. Seth had the carved wooden horse in his hand. He carried it the whole way from the ranch, all 3 days, never once setting it down permanently. He looked at the horse. Then he looked at Eli. Thomas's horse? He said. Full sentence. Clear as a bell. Eli blinked. How did you? He stopped. I never said his name. You talked in your sleep, Clara said quietly. The first night. In the camp. She paused. You said Thomas and Ruth, and I'm sorry a couple times. Eli looked at the table. He wasn't embarrassed. He was something more honest than embarrassed. Yes, he said. It was Thomas's horse. Seth held it out to him, across the table, both hands extended, offering it back. And Eli Cord, who had spent 2 years going still and hard and pointed like an arrowhead toward a single purpose, felt something break loose in his chest, not painfully. The way ice breaks in a river when the season finally turns, sudden and loud and immediately replaced by something that moves. He took the horse. Then, slowly, he held it back out to Seth. You keep it, he said. Until you meet him. Seth looked at the horse. Looked at Eli. Then he drew the horse back to his chest and held it there, and he nodded, and for the first time, the very first time, he almost smiled. Dolan Marsh was arrested 7 weeks later. Federal marshals came into Ridley Flat on a Tuesday morning, the same day Marsh's men usually rode the Southern Ridge Road, which struck Eli, when he heard about it later, as a detail the universe seemed to have arranged for its own amusement. Judge Harlan Fitch resigned from the bench before charges could be formally filed, citing health reasons that fooled no one. 3 county commissioners faced federal inquiry. The fraudulent land patent was voided. The restoration process was slow, as Aldous had said it would be. The Garza brothers got their land back after 14 months of legal proceedings. Old Sutter's claim was restored to his daughter, who had taken over after his death. The Perkins family had moved on and couldn't be found. Eli Cord's homestead in the Cimarron Valley was formally restored to him in the spring of the following year. He wasn't living in it. He was in Tucson. Ruth had read his letter twice and then sat down and then stood up and then asked her sister to watch Thomas for an hour while she walked around the block several times. Which was how Ruth processed things that mattered. When she came back, she wrote Eli a letter of her own. It said, "Come home? Bring them." The night they arrived in Tucson, Eli, Clara, and Seth, Thomas Cord was waiting on the porch with a rock in his hand. He held it out to Seth within approximately 45 seconds of introduction, because he had decided immediately that this was someone who would understand the significance of a rock with iron deposits in it. Seth had held the wooden horse out in return. The 2 boys had looked at each other's offerings very seriously. Then they'd gone inside. Clara stood on the porch with Ruth and Eli for a moment. Ruth put her hand on Clara's shoulder, not grabbing, just resting. A question, not a statement. Clara leaned into it slightly, by about half an inch, which from Clara was practically a declaration. It wasn't a perfect ending. Those don't exist, not in the West, not anywhere. The legal proceedings were grinding and impersonal, and the homestead sat empty for over a year before Eli could get back to it. Cutter Vance was never charged with anything specific enough to stick, and walked free, and the thought of that lived in Eli's chest like a stone he'd learned to breathe around. May Doves never got to know that her words had mattered. She never got to know that the document she'd written in a rented room with a fever and shaking hands had helped pull down a corrupt machine and restore land to people who'd earned it. She never got to know that her children were all right. Some people do the right thing and don't get to see it. That's the part that doesn't have a satisfying answer. But Clara knew. Clara carried her mother's face, and her mother's handwriting, and her mother's conviction that the truth written down was worth the effort of writing it. She carried it the way she'd carried that oilcloth-wrapped document across a dark desert in boots 3 sizes too large, one step at a time, looking for a light. She found one. It was dying down when she found it. Just an old rancher eating alone at a table built for more people than were using it, too hollowed out by loss to look up from his plate. But it was still burning. And sometimes that's enough. Seth never stopped talking again. Within a year, Thomas said he never stopped, period, and could they please have some quiet? Ruth said no. Eli said nothing, but his face did something it hadn't done in years. The wooden horse sat on the windowsill of the room the boys shared, Thomas's horse, made from cedar on a cold December night by a man who had nothing but a knife and time and love. It caught the morning light every day and threw a small curved shadow on the wall. It was still there when they were grown. And the last thing Eli Cord said, the night before he finally rode back to the Cimarron Valley to walk his land again, was not to a person. He was standing in the doorway of the boys' room, both of them asleep, the horse on the sill, the shadow on the wall, and he stood there for a long time in the quiet. And he said, very softly, to the room, to the dark, to no one and everyone, "I hear you." Not forgiveness. Not resolution. Not the clean, uncomplicated ending that stories are supposed to have. Just a man, listening again. After everything, was he right to open that door? Or did opening it just mean the world could hurt him again? Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe that's exactly the same thing, and we open it anyway. Subscribe for more true stories from the frontier, where every choice left a mark, and every door opened changed everything on both sides.